Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see everyone, and also those who are joining us in person and online. As usual, we have quite a bit to get through, so let's make a start. And first of all, acknowledgement of country, if I may. In welcoming you to this gathering, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where we gather in person today. Thank you. As we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I recognize the unique connection of the First Nations to country and their role in caring for and maintaining country over tens of thousands of years. May long overdue justice be done to them, and may their wisdom and resilience be with us today. So, a few things to draw your attention to before we get going. The first thing is that we're going to have, as you can imagine, a very packed program, which is nothing new, but it'll be especially so because we want to leave a bit of extra time for our two guests, since we have two rather than one, in the second half of the evening. Well, evening for us, other time zones, it's of course different. Now, you also will appreciate that they're going to be dealing with issues that are in some way sensitive, and they have asked whether we could agree to their contribution not being recorded, and we have struck a compromise. We will record their presentation, which will be relatively short, both of them, and then the conversation I will have with them and the Q&A will not be recorded. So for those who've missing the evening or the session this evening here in Melbourne or wherever they happen to be, in other parts of the country or overseas, and you're not in attendance, I'm afraid you're going to miss what probably is the most interesting part of the evening, okay? When they will feel free to speak a little more frankly than they would be if they knew they were being recorded. Both of them are under considerable pressure, as you would expect. These are extremely tense times, as we will see. Now, before I get going, I want to tell you about a couple of things, a couple of announcements. I mentioned last time the annual oration, the second time we're having the annual oration, the second time. We had the first one last year to be delivered by Professor Raymond Gaita. So if we can look at that. It's probably the fourth slide. Oh, I don't know why it's not there. Where is it? No. Maybe it's towards the end. I'll come back to it. Let me see where it. I thought it was towards the beginning, and I may have misled you. Yes, it's later on. Later on. Forget about that. I'll tell you about the thing more later. But next Tuesday, I want to just briefly draw your attention to what we're going to be doing. It's the last one, of course, and I thought it would be fitting to end with one of the big unresolved questions in many parts of the world, but especially in Australia, and that's the relationship between the Indigenous people and the settler communities. And most of us are settlers in this land. So what we're trying to do is do something which is a little bit different. First of all, it comes a year after. So this is a critical moment. A year after, those who supported the referendum were terribly despondent and disheartened. Others who opposed it because they didn't think it went far enough. And there was much to be said for that view. It was, in the view of some at least, an initiative doomed to fail, doomed from the very beginning and very poorly executed, etc., etc. So there's a lot to be said for taking stock. There is a lot of confusion in the land about where to next. And the one thing, of course, that the referendum fell far short of is the point that I perhaps have made in passing once or twice, namely that the key is for the settler community to understand the nature of indigenous wisdom. Nothing will happen until such time as that happens. And so we will get Celeste Little, who is a rather formidable woman, indigenous, unionist, organizer, activist, feminist, etc. And she will initiate the discussion, and we'll have plenty of opportunities to have a conversation with her about the way forward. Of course, it's one perspective, but it'll be, I think you will find a very interesting, highly articulate person who will present a very interesting perspective on this question. So again, if you have any friend that would be interested, anyone you know, they would be welcome, but I suggest they register earlier rather than later. Okay. So to our topic this evening, and I will say more about the program next week in a few minutes, and then some announcements a bit later. We're going to be, as you know, speaking about this major conflict that has erupted in the Middle East and its repercussions the world over. Many societies in many parts of the world have been very badly affected by it. And Australia is a prime example. And we'll look at that in a minute. But before we can look at how it has impacted, let's say, in Australia and others who are in other countries, be it Britain, Great Britain, or the UK, or somewhere else, part of Europe, anywhere else, they can make their own assessment of how it is impacting on them. What I want to look at is what it tells us, the war in Gaza, about the world today. About how the world is managing or not managing to respond to this major event of historical proportions. And then how it affects the politics of particular countries' societies. In many ways, it shines the spotlight on both the world as a whole and individual countries. Their inability to know how to respond is a classic illustration of political decadence in many parts of the world. Decadence is, if I may say so, rather a euphemism. We can use much stronger words to describe the situation. All right. We know the background. We know the background, at least for the last year. We also know that this has a history at least since the Second World War, and in fact, since the First World War. So we are talking about something that has well over 100-year history, and that has affected every major power in the world, great power. Britain to begin with, the United States, most of the European countries, all of the Middle East, and many others. It's one of the crunch points in the world system today. It has been and continues to be. Could you hear me?
Better now.
Apologies, I hadn't turned it on. Anyhow, so that's a bit too loud, isn't it?
Turned the volume very loud because I thought it was me, not you.
Okay. If there's some technological error, you can bet your bottom dollar it's me. All right. Well, just to concentrate for the moment over the last year, we know, of course, the events of the 7th of October, which were being remembered yesterday. It's another year later, 2 years later, the indigenous issue and the Israel-Palestinian issue. Well, in that year, we know that 1,200 people in Israel, including some foreigners, were attacked in a maneuver that Hamas has claimed as its own. 1,200 people, 1,200 casualties, 200 odd people, 250, 60 people were taken hostage. Half of them have been released, but 40 to 50 of them dead, and the other half still in somewhere, hidden somewhere. By the way, it's interesting how militarily the Israeli push has been weak, how weak it has been. A year and they still can't find them. It's extraordinary how weak it has been. Never mind the strength. You can flex muscle as much as you like on the ring and still not win. Still not win. All right, but that's by the by. We know that the Israel military, since October the 7th, has been targeting neighborhoods, population centers, and that includes schools, refugee centers, and hospitals. We now know that 70% of crop fields have been destroyed, probably more. Close to 1.5 million people have been displaced, which is roughly 3/4 of the population, 2/3, somewhere around 2/3 of the population. Food supplies are waiting and can't get through to feed those who are very close to hunger. But the interesting thing, of course, these are huge numbers. The smaller number is nevertheless the fascinating one, that 200 international aid workers wearing the UN flag have also been killed, even when their locations were precisely known by the Israeli military, because they constantly communicated. And now in Lebanon, in the space of 2 weeks, over 2,000, close to 2,000 people killed. I think it's really over 2,000 people killed now, of which well over 100 are children and 250 to 300 are said to be women. So if we look at the map, you can see how virtually the military operation has taken over, all intents and purposes, the whole of the Gaza Strip. Whether it is through military operation, evacuation zones, which means mass displacement, and refugee camps, which themselves have come under constant fire. So that's just the background. And so we need to ask, what of the international community's response? Is the international community a mere spectator, doing nothing and caring less? Well, that's not really true. Much has been done on many fronts, and I'll just mention 4 of them. The UN has been, despite what I will say in a moment, very much at the center of activity in helping to organize relief, convoys, focusing attention on the humanitarian need, detailed reporting day in, day out, and constant statements by the UN Secretary General, who has been utterly fearless. Of course, it's his second term and he can't get a third term, so there's not much anyone can do about it. And he's done it with great skill, and so she should have skill. He was, after all, for several years, had the leading political job in his home country, Portugal. It's interesting, for example, that Israel just a few days ago declared him persona non grata in Israel. And for once, the United Nations Security Council stood at one in supporting him. The UN has done a great deal. It has focused global attention on the issue. And it has been remarkably fearless in both condemning the Hamas attack and in the subsequent events that have unfolded. So has the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice has excelled itself. It has risen to greater heights than at any stage since its birth, because it has given two extraordinary judgments. The first was the result of the South African initiative, which took Israel to the International Court of Justice, and the result of which was that the International Court basically agreed with the South African submission, stating that there were definitely plausible grounds for describing the actions of Israel as genocidal. And that's it. There is no higher court of appeal. That's it. It's final. And initially, the chair of the International Court of Justice, 15 judges, was an American, who would have been nominated on their appointment by the US administration. So when the United States tried in some way to call into question the judgment of the International Court of Justice, it got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. No European country went along with that. None of the allies, nor has Australia. Incredibly, but it has stood and said it abides by the International Court of Justice's judgment. Of course, it hasn't been implemented, we know that. And then a second judgment, which again was not taken direct notice by the Israeli government, but nevertheless called into question its unwillingness to abide by the steps which the International Court of Justice had laid out. And the other thing to say is that the global south, meaning all the countries that were formerly colonies of the West in Africa, Asia, Latin America, have by and large taken steps, with perhaps the meekest, strangely enough, of them being a number of key Arab countries, of which Saudi Arabia is the classic instance, because they have interests of their own, they're playing their own game, and have, by and large, been bystanders. That's very interesting. We haven't got time to go into that. But the most important, probably, manifestation of global interest has been global civil society, which has been highly visible in many parts of the world, throughout Europe. Australia, we know, endless number of protests, week in, week out, usually a Sunday, involving tens of thousands of people, engaging different forms of protests and advocacy. And in London just last Sunday, tens and tens of thousands assembling in different parts of England. But that being said, the fact is the fighting rages on in Gaza. For all these efforts, all that visibility of the issue, the fighting continues with no immediate end in sight. And something else has happened. It's no longer confined to Gaza. It has spread to the West Bank, the other part of the Palestinian occupied territories, and it now has spread to Lebanon. And as I've already mentioned, there have been a good number of casualties, and the whole of Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, now lives in dread from one minute to the next, because they don't know where the next attack will be. And that includes, of course, large numbers of Lebanese who are not at all supportive of Hezbollah, because you can't discriminate. You can't say this person is a pro-Hezbollah supporter, this one is an opponent, this one sits somewhere in the middle, we'll just target that one. Impossible to do. But the most important and the most dangerous development is the escalation into an Israeli-Iranian conflict. And then it would be for young and old. And then it wouldn't be in the tens or hundreds of thousands, it would be the millions. It would be millions who would die. And it's worse than that. Because if Iran was to attack Israel beyond what it has done, and of course Israel attacking Iran, that would provide the United States with the pretext it needs to attack Iran itself. And then it's anyone's guess what would happen at that point. But we'd be looking at millions dying in the conflict, and it could happen in 2025, not 10 years down the track. I'm not saying it will. Understand? I'm not saying it will, but I'm just saying that the escalation points to that as a possibility and not a minute possibility. And the test, immediate test, will be whether Israel retaliates against the latest Iranian attack on Israel, which was itself a response to Israel's attack on Iran. And then that's where the escalation will become very serious. And the question then is whether the United States will itself intervene. And so the loss of life and destruction goes on. Even as of now, we know that reconstruction of the Palestinian territories, and it now looks reconstruction of Lebanon, will cost hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions, maybe more than $1 trillion. And the question is, who has their hands in their pocket ready with a checkbook? Is Australia one of them? It'd be interesting to find out. You know, $1 million here and $1 million there is not even pocket money for this operation. And it would take, the ecological damage is already severe, very severe, and it would take probably a minimum of 3 decades to recover from that position prior to the last 12 months. Now, quickly, why has it come to this? Well, a number of factors, interconnected. Why has the world not responded more forcefully, more effectively, despite all the moves that I've just outlined briefly? First of all, the structure of the United Nations itself. It is the legacy of the way the UN was constructed at the end of World War II, which was that 5 countries would be permanent members of the Security Council and have the power of veto. And the Security Council is supposed to have primacy in dealing with all security-related questions, not the General Assembly, but the Security Council. And so we're in that melting pot where you have the great powers at loggerheads. And so it is very difficult for the United Nations Security Council to take any effective action, at least till now, even when the vote is something like 1 against, 2 or 3 abstentions, and the rest 4 out of 15. It's still, the conclusion is in the negative. And the one, of course, has been the United States. So the structure of the UN system, of the UN Security Council, has been one of the important issues. And there are many suggestions on the table as to how one might be able to reconfigure that arrangement. Many suggestions, and much discussion now taking place in many quarters, the belief being that the United Nations cannot continue the way it is. Something's got to give. The other issue is the question of international law. Yes, the International Court of Justice is doing well in terms of assessing the legal issues, but the reality is that national legal systems are not prepared to give effect to the judgments of the International Court of Justice, or at least some of them are not willing to give effect. And that raises the question of state sovereignty. State sovereignty cannot be used, and certainly should not be able to be used, as an argument against an international legal framework. That was never the intention. The intention was that when international law is clear, then states have to abide by it, and that's it. But that has been eroded, and the erosion of that principle has become especially acute over this conflict, where one state, we know who it is, and its principal backer, virtually alone, on their own, have treated the international law generally and International Court of Justice with complete disdain. And so that raises issues as to how that should be dealt with in the time ahead. The other interesting development is the relative weakness of Arab governments. The Arab street is seething with anger at what is happening in the Middle East. But that's not reflected in the actions of their respective governments in most places, with 1 or 2 exceptions, partial exceptions. So the weakness of the Arab world, and it's made up primarily of a series of authoritarian governments or military regimes, is itself in the longer run unsustainable. The disparity between what Arab governments are doing or not doing and the popular sentiment of those countries cannot remain as it is indefinitely. So something will have to give in due course. In all of this, of course, the role of the United States. Now, the United States is in a quandary because it still has the world's most powerful military machine by a substantial margin, but it has a totally incompetent political system. Biden versus Trump. Have you ever seen anything more ridiculous? For the world's greatest power. Inconceivable that you could have two, let me say it bluntly, two such idiotic human beings aspiring to be president of the United States, the world's most powerful military machine. Incredible. And don't get too excited about the replacement. What she doesn't know about international relations would fill the books of untold libraries. Don't expect anything of substance to emerge post-election. So it's a difficulty, and it's a difficulty that goes right to the roots of American society, American politics, and the way a security policy is developed and implemented. And the last thing I want to point is, again, at the level of governments, that most US governments of most US allies have been, in this instance, remarkably timid. And the classic instance, of course, is the Australian government. Not much difference between the Australian government and the UK government. Very similar. And the German government, but the German government has its own difficulties, its own problems. It has the Holocaust legacy to contend with. So it's in a kind of very difficult situation, which shouldn't really affect the likes of Britain, Australia, Canada, or for that matter, France. Now, France has now begun to move. And it'll be interesting to see how it goes. President Macron, just a few days ago, said it is time to stop arms sales to Israel. That obviously creates interesting tensions within the alliance system, but we'll see what happens. It may have been a throwaway few lines, or it may be a serious, the beginning of a serious set of steps. We have to wait and see. So you can see that the world is poised on, you can call it a threshold, you can call it a precipice, whatever you like to call it, but what the issue in Gaza is, it exposes the weaknesses of the world system, as no other crisis, even the Ukraine, has yet done. And we shall see to what extent the world community is able to recover from this serious exposure of the weakness of the framework we have, legal, political, social, and cultural, in the world today, and whether it can cope with crises of this sort. Now, for Australia. Just a few words, because our two guests will no doubt talk more about this. The tensions are very high. Very, very high. I can't begin to describe them. If you know well the Jewish community, and if you know well the Muslim community, there is seething anger leveled against each other. Seething. And I can tell you one thing, it's not going to get better very soon or very easily. And what that does, it calls into question the multicultural fabric of Australian society. See, an event so far away, nevertheless, has extraordinary social and cultural impact on this country, and other countries too, including the likes of Britain and France and elsewhere, where there are substantial communities directly impacted by events in the Middle East. And related to that is the sheer incompetence of government. That's putting it charitably. I'm in a charitable mood tonight, and I'll just call it incompetence. Incompetence. Haven't got a clue how to react. They don't know. They don't understand. They don't understand the conflict deeply. They don't understand the dynamics of these two communities. They think, insofar as they think at all, and they don't do much thinking. I can assure you that's correct. They think that the old recipes of 10, 20, 30 years ago will do the trick. Well, it's not doing the trick. I have been directly involved in discussions, and I know how little state government really understands. To take an example in Victoria, no idea about how to bring the two communities together. No idea what would happen if by some chance you were able to bring them together. What would you expect? The one thing they want is the political outcome. Nothing to damage our election prospects come the election. That's what they're interested in. And therefore, do very little, because if you do too much, you ran the risk of creating backlash, which then could be used by opposition parties to your disadvantage. Therefore, you have to protect as much as you can your base, your electoral base. You don't know what kind of a media campaign could be launched against you at a moment's notice. All the major media pointing towards you and your weakness, whatever it may be, your missteps, etc., or what are perceived to be. So you do as little as possible, and just the odd statement from time to time to humor that side, and then another little statement to humor the other side. And both remain totally unconvinced. So that's a problem. And then the faith communities themselves. The faith communities themselves, complete lack of leadership, except in a couple of exceptions, apart from a couple of exceptions. Unable to steer their respective communities in a way that might make dialogue possible. Dialogue about issues affecting Australia directly, and dialogue about issues to do with the Middle East. And the next step, and the next contributing factor, an ill-informed public, poorly served by terribly flawed reporting and analysis in our media. None of that makes for a very pleasant reading or thinking about, but it is the reality. I've deliberately overstated the point, but not only by little, in order to convey to you the seriousness of the issues and the inability of our political framework, and perhaps even our cultural framework, to deal with a major crisis. And we still say what a glorious multicultural society this is. And what is true of the domestic policy is also true of our foreign policy. If you were to ask anyone here, what is the government's policy in relation to the crisis? I bet you'd be struggling to formulate it in 2 or 3 clear sentences. What is it? What is the outcome it would wish to see in practical terms? Don't use abstractions. A just peace. What does a just peace look like? A ceasefire. How does a ceasefire come about? Silence. Nothing. There's nothing there. It is empty. There's emptiness. There's emptiness, and don't just blame, we don't just blame, and we shouldn't, the politicians. They are dependent on their advisors and on government departments. And they too are pretty well empty. There is very little there that really grasps the complexity of the issues involved and the implication, not least whether or not Australia can chart a policy that is its own as opposed to the policy of a great and powerful friend. There is very little understanding of the connection between foreign policy and multicultural policy. And this has been the way all the way through. All the way through. We have a very significant, as you know, Afghani community now in Australia. They were never consulted once during 20 years of military engagement in Afghanistan. Can you believe that? Can you believe it? They might know something about the country. They might even be told, attack there, but not there, because if you attack there, that might happen. They might know something. Not many know the Afghani language, I can tell you, in our diplomatic service. How do you negotiate it? Anyhow, that's a red herring, but you understand the principle I'm coming at. There is no ability to turn multiculturalism to a big plus in the conduct of your external relations. This huge asset of different cultures, different faiths, different languages, brought to the service of your external links, external ties, has not been attempted under any government in Australia so far. Maybe it will one day. Okay, now, a few questions, if there are some. Online, here, in person. I know it's not very uplifting what I've been saying, but if you're suffering from a serious ailment, it's better to diagnose it than dress it up as minor indigestion.
We've got a few questions online.
Questions online? Yes.
Yep. Can I
Sorry,
ask a
give
question?
One moment, I'm just going to turn the speaker on online. Online, who have we got first? It looks as though Sandy.
Yep.
Hi there, it's Sandy Killick speaking. Professor Camilleri, you said that our social and political systems are having immense trouble grappling with this situation. What can we do to build up that capacity for the future?
Next time we could take a couple of questions together. Yeah, do you want to take another question? I'll still.
Is it Shoba? You can.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Camilleri, for a brilliant and concise sort of recap of the current situation and the status. I'm just horrified that we can't seem to do anything. It's similar to the previous question. But what I'm really, really angry about is that it just seems to be used and we seem to be politically manipulated. So is there some way we can stop that? And how can we get the UN to actually move and act? And how can each one of us act? And, you know, as you say, cut the rhetoric, let's do something. Thank you.
Okay. The two questions, as you can see, are very similar, so I'll take them together. What we can do? Well, at the end of the day, one of the major problems is a poorly informed, insufficiently engaged society. I mean, yes, there is a small percentage, maybe 5%, who are highly engaged, doing all kinds of things. That's fine. But the wider society, not sufficiently engaged and not sufficiently aware of what is happening either in the country itself or internationally. So the answer to that is twofold and closely connected: education and conversation. They're the two most powerful tools at our disposal. If you had, projecting into the future, a situation where, let's say, every day of the year, you know that there are thousands of conversations going on about the situation, where are we at, are we at and where we should be heading. What a difference that would make. Immediately, everyone would know that that's happening. The media would feel they need to respond to that. And at some point, even the political process would want to respond to that. But that's where initiative can come from. It will not come from above, because above, they like peace and quiet and as little change as possible, if they can get away with it. There is no feeling for change, for rethinking, for some boldness. I should have said, by the way, that one of the things that Australia should be doing, would be doing so easily, is to consult with its neighbours, with its regional neighbours, about what is an appropriate initiative or initiatives internationally. How could you not be consulting with Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world? How could you do it? Not consulting them about some trade relationship, which we do a lot of, but consulting them about this problem and what they would see as useful steps forward. You could involve Malaysia, you could involve Vietnam, several other countries. They don't do that because so much emphasis is placed on the communication with one other major center. And you know where that is. And the second center, you know where that is. And they're both roughly 10,000 miles away in opposite directions, geographically. So that has to change. And part of that is that Anglo-Australia, forget about Indigenous Australia for the moment, Anglo-Australia has to become in much closer contact with its other cultures, its other communities, its other ethnic background. You have to hear what different communities are thinking about these conflicts, which directly impact them. They have people, family, friends who are dying, who are injured, who are displaced, who are hungry. They have a great deal of insight to be shared. And there must be more encounters, therefore, between the different strands of Australian society. It's interesting, for example, that one very significant development in the last more than 12 months now, a couple of years, has been the growing interest of the Indigenous community in the Palestinian question and vice versa. It has been quite a steady development because they see similarities. It would be good if Anglo-Australians were to become part of that conversation. So that's very important. I've mentioned some possibilities on the international front and some possibilities on the domestic front, but ultimately all of them depend on engagement by the community itself. It can't be done for the community by someone else. There's no someone else willing and able to do it. It has to come up. It's long, it's not a quick fix, but I think that is the most promising option that we have at this moment. All right, another one, yes. You better come here.
Very much appreciated. Are you able to say anything more about why these the neighbouring Arab governments are being so cavalier and not helping? Do they not regard the Palestinians in Israel as their brothers?
Another question here, Joe, if you wanted to take two.
Okay.
You could just come a little bit close.
Actually, I was just wondering, following up from your other one, a long history of migration we've had to this country, and in the really early days, going back to European migration, was there more of an effort in those days, in the 50s and 40s and 60s, to bring these communities into discussion than there is today, or has it been pretty much consistent as it is now? With
And how we have handled the new emerging communities in Australia. Arab countries, well, a number of them, and especially the Gulf Arab states, are very closely connected to the United States, and for a very important reason. Well, a number of related reasons. Number one, these governments are not by and large very popular, right? So they've got to be, they have to be assisted to retain power. And one of the things that gives them respectability and strength is the support of Western governments. So Saudi Arabia, being the most important of these, depends entirely on the United States for its military imports, largely on the United States for its military imports. And because it has so much wealth, oil wealth, it is able to spend tens and tens of billions of dollars. Its budget is much greater than Israel's, for example. That's Saudi Arabia. It's trained by the United States. It's equipped by the United States. Strategic intelligence is shared with the United States. And it's politically supportive. So once you're in that spot, that place, it's very difficult to suddenly take a position which squarely calls into question the positions of its principal backer. That is, you see, the interesting commonality. Israel and several of these Arab governments have, the Israeli government and many of these Arab governments have one thing in common. Their principal backer is the United States. And a lot flows from that. And therefore, the Gulf oil states, with the partial little exception of Qatar, have been largely ineffectual and said very little. Of course, they make statements. They make statements, so long as no action follows the statement. And yes, they will vote for certain things in the General Assembly, but they know that it'll get nowhere. So there is no cost involved in doing those little cosmetic things, which they do. Now, no, I think it's fair to say that governments in Australia have traditionally looked upon migrant communities as useful, increasing the population, economic benefits, but they have not necessarily been enamored of the idea that they should share in the decision-making of this country. And I think that remains so even now, by and large. There are little steps being taken, yes. There's a few members of parliament, state and federal, who now represent a number of migrant communities, yes. But they do it within the two major powers, the two major party system. And they are clearly run, not by them, but by those who have run these parties for a very long time. With, you know, and by and large, those who join those parties have been enculturated in the interest of advancement, personal advancement, but even group advancement, to follow the lead that is given by those who are dominant and powerful. Therefore, you won't get into the parliament many non-Anglo voices that are highly critical of the system. You can see when one did inside the Labour Party, she was told the time is up for her to leave. And that's what she's done. That's just one little example, but by and large, they have not been taken terribly seriously when it comes to the highest echelons of decision-making. Even though those who are not born in Australia or who have at least one parent not born in Australia is just short of 50% of the Australian population. So something will have to give in due course. 50% of Australians were rather not born here or have at least one parent not born here. So you can't forever exclude those from the highest decision levels of decision making. It'll have to change, but I think it's part of a historical pattern that has not changed a great deal, though there is a lot more rhetoric about multiculturalism than there was 20 years ago. And there are whole series of events and grant schemes to assist migrant communities, but that's in terms of economic assistance, social assistance, not in terms of sharing decision-making at the highest levels. At this stage, it might change. All right, I think we better move on. Now, if we can, I can show you the next slide. It's just to let you know of another event which touches on the questions we are dealing with. And that is to happen Sunday, the 20th of October. It's an international event. And unfortunately for Australia, because we're right at the edge, the time is very awkward, but for what it's worth, I'm letting you know about it. You can always, if you register, get the recording later. It's free. And there will be 4 key people who will be contributing to the discussion. Professor Richard Falk, who, by the way, was UN Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine for a number of years. Hans Vosponek, who held many UN positions in different periods and was UN Assistant Secretary General for a couple of years. In some ways, the more interesting, perhaps, is Grace Naledi Pandor, who was South Africa's foreign minister for about 5 years. She's just left government post-election. She held ministerial positions for many, many years. She entirely rejigged the South African education system during her role, during her period of office. And she was the one that played the leading role in taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. She did it on behalf of course, the South African government. And Vijay Prashad, probably less well known, but an author and head of an institute for social research. So it'll be very interesting. And the idea is, I have some involvement with this initiative. The idea is to see whether we can crystallize a few key ideas for moving forward in 2 key areas: the UN system and international law, and what the implications of that might be for different countries in different parts of the world. So just bringing that to your attention in case you're interested. The time for Australia is Eastern Australia is very awkward. It's 11 p.m, but if you're in Perth, it's a bit better. Okay, more to tell you later in the evening, but now we need to get to our groups. And time is short, so let's do the best we can until about, we'll go for about 20 minutes. Now, what we want to look, of course, at the questions we have been looking at. And you can see them there. You have no way of handling all these questions in the time allocated, but at least they make you think, and you can start with the first question or the second or the third question. It doesn't matter. Each in its own ways introduces you to some of the complex issues we have to grapple with, both externally and internally in our respective countries, in the case of most in Australia. So I'm sure you'll have a very lively conversation. We might take an extra few minutes to get to the break, but go for it, please. And there should be, I hope, a facilitator in each table. And if there isn't, let's make sure there is. Okay, off you go. John, you can facilitate. Come through. Because and a lot of people who either come and those who don't come are particularly keen to receive recordings of the sessions, but we will not record the conversation and Q&A segments that will follow their presentation. So that's what we're doing, and we respect the sensitivity of the issues they're going to be discussing, and we are most interested in dialogue, and hopefully this arrangement will contribute to a more effective and fascinating dialogue. Well, let me first introduce Susan. Susan's an academic, a writer, and a social commentator. I dare say many of you will have come across her work in one way or another. She teaches and researches at Monash University with a focus on gender, sociology, terrorism, Islam in the modern world, contemporary Australia. She has done quite a lot of work in media. She hosted the Assumption series on ABC Radio National. She's often interviewed various media outlets, hosts the multi-award-winning podcast, What Happens Next, which has gone into numerous episodes. I don't know how you do it. She was named one of the 20 most influential Australian female voices in the list put out by The Age. She has been listed on the 500 most influential Muslims in the world list, and as a Muslim leader of tomorrow by the UN Alliance of Civilizations. Her writing appears in various newspapers, academic journals, websites, and anthologies. Her first monograph was Fighting Islam, and she is involved in a very important research project, and I'm sure she will in due course tell us something about that. Susan?
Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. All right. Why did my heart wince when I read the title Ethics in Turbulent Times? Why does this question hurt? Why does it feel so impossible? And it does feel uniquely impossible right now. I've lived through many socially challenging times in Australia. This feels singularly hard to navigate ethically. The discussion here in Australia about the Israel-Gaza war feels different to other social issues. And I must emphasise I'm referring here to our discussion in Australia about the war and not the war itself. I dare not propose how the innocent and everyday people of Palestine or Israel should structure their morality. It would be crass and insensitive of me to suggest it. But our discussion here in Australia feels unique in part because it has never felt so zero-sum for me. There are multiple reasons for this, but one that stands out is that I've never seen the extent of people completely unwilling to acknowledge the suffering of the other side. Where objective suffering of the other side is minimised because it's not as bad as the suffering of my side. It's dismissed because the other side has ultimately brought it on themselves, or it is simply ignored as untrue. Where even to have empathy for an innocent victim on the other side is seen as somehow arguing for moral equivalency in toto. Being actively indifferent to the pain of people not in our group is nothing new, but I've never experienced it here in Australia to the level I have during this time. Where even simply acknowledging that the other side has suffered or continues to suffer is seen as a capitulation. That somehow even recognising this is a betrayal of our own side. That if I acknowledge any suffering on the other side, I am diminishing the suffering of my side. I am dishonouring my victims. I understand it, of course. When your group's suffering feels so immense and the world seems so indifferent, affirming that pain to the exclusion of all else feels existential. Has the grief of one group caused the suffering of the other? We can ask that of ourselves here, and we can ask that of the people with weapons overseas. But if we are interested in an ethical model in this time, here in Australia, this way of thinking does not feel sustainable. It also feels uniquely difficult to navigate this ethically in Australia at the moment because of the seeming contradictions of this terrain. Words are violence, but silence is violence. You must speak up, but not like that. Everything we do matters. Every word, every action signifies something, and yet nothing we do seems to matter. How can I have an individual responsibility to address this enormous structural problem? What is the individual moral requirement of me right here? I see us swing between a rigid demand for everyone to think and behave exactly like us or a descent into nihilism. I can't fix this, it's too hard, so why even care? It's for this reason that it has been argued regular ethics do not suffice here. We are in need of what Travis Reeder calls catastrophe ethics, a reconfigured ethics that takes into account the global scale of the problems we as individuals are now faced with. 3,000 years ago, we worried about the people of our village. We might hear that a neighbouring village was burned down, but that news took 2 weeks to reach us. Now we know about every disaster and catastrophe instantly and constantly. We are wired to want to help. This desire made sense and worked in a village or town of a few hundred people. But what do I do with a desire to help for people on the other side of the world I can't reach, facing problems I cannot change? So we turn to the small power we do have, our voices. We shout at protests, but mostly at each other online. We demand that everyone else bend not just to our ways of believing, but our ways of demonstrating that belief. The performativity of belief aligned with ours is the only acceptable approach. As a sociologist of religion, I recognize the fundamentalism of this, the puritanical approach that is wielded like a sword at everyone else to conform to our way of being. It's interesting how often that is what we want, when at the same time we so often say, why can't we all just agree and get along? When what we mean by this is, everyone agrees with me. We never mean for us to change to another way of thinking for the sake of unity. And as a Muslim, from an Islamic point of view, uniformity of belief should never be the goal. One verse in the Quran says, and if God willed, he could have made you into a single community. This shows how uniformity of belief was never part of the Islamic divine plan. While not arguing that every belief or attitude is morally acceptable or equal, we can also entertain that different attitudes to ours may be okay. And so to the topic of this series, how to bring society to a higher ground. I'm not sure that's the right focus. I think part of the problem we are seeing in our society today is the focus on what other people are doing and how we can get them to do what we want. I think the focus primarily needs to be on how do I bring myself to a higher ground. Not because I only care about myself and to hell with everyone else, but because there is a lot of criticism of the beliefs and behaviours of others and very little holding ourselves to a higher standard, of demanding more of ourselves, of moral elevation and spiritual discipline, of a sincere and robust commitment to justice. When I say that in our current context, what do you think of? What does justice look like now? Significantly on this, a verse in the Quran says, stand firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even if it be against your own selves. Our firm commitment to justice must start with making sure we are being just, not soothing our egos and our wounds and calling it justice, but genuine justice. That cannot always be just an outward accusation. And I think the thing is, when we ask more of ourselves and live according to that ethic, we will influence others to come along with us. So what does it look like to care about the hurt of others in this time in Australia? Of course, this can take many forms. But one way my colleague David and I wanted to address it was to start a large program to tackle anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian sentiment on our university campus at Monash. We wanted to look at it all, and we wanted to do it together. Not just me looking at Islamophobia and David just looking at anti-Semitism. We care about all of it. I, as a Muslim, have heard what Jewish students have said about anti-Semitism, and it troubles me. I do not want Jewish students at my university facing anti-Semitism. And I know David feels the same about Muslim students facing Islamophobia. Neither of us feels it diminishes the experience of our own group to acknowledge the harm experienced by the other. Here in these turbulent times in Australia, we are trying to acknowledge the pain of the other and trying to help fix it. We are trying to hold ourselves to higher moral standards and hope that in doing so, we might all find our way to a higher ground. Thank you.
Introduce you.
Oh,
briefly.
sorry.
No,
Please
that's
go
okay.
ahead. I jumped the gun.
No, that's okay. Now, David is also at Monash University and clearly a colleague of Susan's. Is an author and historian specializing in 20th century Jewish history, popular culture, and memoir writing. His work looks particularly at the aftermath of the Holocaust, focusing on how survivors have rebuilt their lives in different contexts. In 2019, he published a multi-generational family memoir describing the story of his family, spanning 4 generations, and recently co-edited a volume on the intersection between humor and Holocaust memory and representation. He's been working on a book project looking at Holocaust survivors in different countries, and the way in which they collectively think of their Holocaust experiences. He's written quite a bit. Just to mention a couple of things, journal articles, second and third generation Holocaust writing in Australia towards a cultural history, belonging across the diaspora, global Jewish organizations, like a family, an investigation into gender in Melbourne's Jewish organizations. So you can see a wide range of knowledge about issues that are highly pertinent to the subject matter that we're dealing with. It's a pleasure to introduce David Slucki.
Thanks, Derek, for the kind introduction. I always feel very inadequate being introduced after Susan. And I feel very lucky to work with Susan and to call her a friend. And I'll say a little more about that today. I want to start though, because we're late and I missed it. So I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're gathered on today. I guess here the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, pay respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. You know, as a scholar of the aftermath of the Holocaust and of mass violence against Jews, I'm very sensitive to taking that responsibility seriously in thinking about what it means to write the histories that I write about on this land. And I live on the land of the Bunurong people. So what I'm going to do is talk a little about go into a bit more detail about the origin story of our collaboration, and sort of think about how that asks this question: how do we do this work around constructive dialogue, around creating a more robust community? And in our case, we're starting with the university, but we really want to model what it takes to create a more sustainable democratic society more broadly. So Susan and I, we met early last year, early 2023. We've been colleagues for about 5 years since I came to Monash. And I knew Susan from her media work, and I knew her podcast. And when someone said to me, "Oh, Susan, Carland wants to come talk to you about this potential project," I was a little bit giddy because I was like, "Oh my God, she's famous," and that's amazing. And so we met, and we sort of talked about collaborating on a project that looked at blasphemy in the Abrahamic religions, and it was a collaboration with a scholar elsewhere. And it was a lovely idea that ultimately went nowhere, but we really liked each other, and we had, I think most importantly, a kind of similar sense of humor, but also a similar sensibility around some of the kinds of things we worked on. So even though I'm a historian and Susan's a sociologist, and our methods are quite different, we really felt a connection that, we had what to talk about in terms of the parallels between Judaism and Islam. So we sort of looked at other ideas, maybe something on Jewish and Muslim humor in comparison, maybe something on food. And we kind of settled on this food idea because we thought it would give us an opportunity to eat lots of very good food. And so we thought the way to start that work would be just to invite each other over into each other's homes and break bread together and meet each other's families. So we did that. I remember Susan saying to me, like, they have people over a lot and people don't often reciprocate. So I was like, we're getting in first on this occasion. So we invited Susan and Walid over for dinner. And by coincidence, it happened to be on October 13th. So we wanted them over for Shabbat dinner. Weeks ahead, we invited them over, and then October 7th happened, and it was very devastating for us. We all had family. I mean, my wife and I and friends, we had family in Israel, and we were terribly worried for their safety. And everyone knew someone who was, you were never more than 1 degree separated from someone either who was killed or taken hostage. And Susan very kindly messaged me probably on the Monday morning and said, look, I don't know what to say, except this is really devastating. And I totally understand if you want to take a rain check for dinner on Friday. And immediately it was clear that that wasn't an option for us. And I wrote back and said, absolutely not. Like, it's more important than it ever has been in the 6 months we've known each other, that we actually do sit down and talk and, you know, grieve together. Because, you know, like the events on October 7th weren't just a matter for Jews to grieve, they were a matter for everyone. And we knew that they were a part of a longer history. We knew that they were part of devastating times that were to come. So we sat together and we had pretty raw conversations, talking about how our communities were faring that week, how the sort of discourse was playing out in social media spheres, on the WhatsApp groups and things like that. And I've got to say, it was very healing. You know, there were areas where we didn't agree and that we didn't always understand. But we found plenty of common ground, and we found a lot of humanity. And that sort of served as a model for the way we work together. That building of trust was really important. And so, you know, we were sort of doing a bit of work around the university to help support the administration in terms of supporting Jewish, Israeli, and Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian students who were in need after that. Just helping them figure out how you best respond to something like this that's so present for so many in our university community. And sometime at the beginning of this year, about January or February, we had both been reflecting on the fact that we were both hearing from students about the terrible experiences that they'd been having with Islamophobia, racism, anti-Semitism. And so we thought, look, we have an opportunity here. You know, we'll set the food thing aside and we'll we'll argue over hummus later. And let's go to the Vice-Chancellor. Let's ask for some money just to do a modest little study to really understand what's happening on campus. So we asked for about $50,000. We thought we'd run a survey, and that sort of sat dormant for a little bit. We had backs and forths. We developed the idea. We, you know, argued over how to spend the little amount of money we were asking for. I know it's glib to say 50,000 is a little amount of money, but in research terms, it doesn't buy you a lot. And then the encampments popped up at Monash, and Susan and I were on the phone at all hours of the morning and night with Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, like, how is this going to play out in your community? What do your students need? What does your general community need? Here's what's going to happen tomorrow. And towards the end of the encampment coming, sort of being there and right before it came down, the Vice-Chancellor announced a suite of measures, which took us a little by surprise. And among those measures to try and ensure a more cohesive campus was to fund the project that we had asked her for, but at 20 times the amount that we had asked for, which, for those of you who are academics, know that that doesn't happen. You normally get much less than what you asked for rather than much more. So once we sort of picked our jaws up off the floor, we sort of figured this is a really good opportunity, you know, to really like investigate what's happening on our campus and come up with a solutions-based program to create a more robust environment, to do what universities are supposed to do, which is teach people how to have conversations, teach them how to critically inquire into the issues of the day. And I think it's become clear to us that we're not doing that well enough. For whatever reason, we have to figure that out still. And so, you know, part of what's been really important to us in doing this work is doing it together and not hiding from that. It's been very difficult, and I'm sure you've talked about this in this series. It's been very difficult for our two communities to sit across a table in public over the last 12 months. I don't think that's ending anytime soon. But the two of us are trying to like find local ways to do that and trying to really model, you know, how you have difficult conversations, how you find common humanity, even when the circumstances don't lend themselves to doing that. So that's our shtick. I also just want to say, you know, I did say this at the start, but I really am grateful to be working with Susan for her amazing intellect, her amazing humanity, and, you know, sense of humor too. Like it's not often you find a collaborator who you can just be completely open and honest with, but who you know has your back all the time. So I do feel really lucky for that. Look, and I'll just finish with this. It's a strange time to be a Jew. I don't know if there's been a time when it's not strange to be a Jew. Maybe every time is. And, you know, this is something that people in my community and the people that I research are navigating. Like, what does it mean to be a Jew in a world in which Jews are on the front page of the newspaper, for better or worse? And I don't know that there's a clear answer to that. And I'm trying to approach things with humility and a kind of deep listening approach. So the final thing I'll say is, and this relates to this, the reason we didn't want to record beyond our initial remarks is we are really conscious of the social media landscape and the ways in which things get really easily taken out of context, and a statement that you make in response to a question can easily be sort of turned into the opposite of what you're actually saying. And given that we're still pretty early in this process of doing this work, we are really conscious of what gets recorded and put out into the world. So thanks for understanding that, because it really does help facilitate the project that we're doing, because, you know, these things can drive a wedge really easily and create problems where we don't want them. So thank you. I really appreciate you having us, Joe.
Susan and the recording stopping, all right?
Oh, okay.
Thanks. Will Susan and David have their own?
Susan will
I
have
can use this.
PAL.
Yep.
Yes.
You and David share the mic.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your introductory remarks and introduction to the very interesting, fascinating project you're embarking on. And a lot of people, I'm sure, will be very interested as it progresses to know what insights it will help generate. I'm going to, we're now going to have a bit of a conversation, the three of us, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from people on the floor here and those who are attending online. I'm sorry?
For the sake of the recording, anyone who's watching this later, can you just let them know it's stopping now?
Say it again.
For the sake of the recording, can you just let them know we're going to stop it now and we'll,
Okay.
so they know there's something missing.
Okay. Emily, who's handling all the technical aspects of the series, tells me it would be wise for me to mention that we're not recording this part. And so when you do get a link to the recording, the part that starts now to the end will not be part of that recording. I've mentioned who are here for 6 weeks, that you have an assignment, and I expect to get it by the due date. There is no such thing as I couldn't. You can try. It's to have 3 conversations around certain issues, and to then report on how you've gone, trying to encourage those 3 conversations. So please, it's very important. If you get anything out of this series, it's hopefully a greater interest, a thirst and enthusiasm for generating conversation, and a little bit of the skill that helps to make it possible. And this leads me to the important event we're going to have on the 3rd of November. Have you got the slide, please, Emily? We're used to that. Here we go. Okay, so on the 3rd of November, if I may please have everyone's attention, because I'd like you, if possible, if you're so inclined, to be ambassadors for the event, and that is our 2nd annual oration, which will be by the very well-known, renowned Raymond Gaita, one of the leading moral philosophers in the world today. And so if I could have everyone's attention, and that includes Monash University. I'd love them to support the 2nd annual oration by Raymond Gaita. Now, here it is, the importance of conversation in the very idea of a common humanity. This will be one of the most definitive statements on the philosophical basis, moral philosophical basis of conversation. And there is no one to equal him probably anywhere in the world on this subject. So he's doing us a great favor in helping us to refine our ideas on the importance of conversation and its integral role in the very idea of a common humanity. There was a cartoon today in The Age. The idea of humanity, shared humanity, is spoken by many who haven't got the flimsiest idea of what a common humanity is. So there's the striking contrast between what these 2 gentlemen think of common humanity and the role of dialogue in that, and what Professor Raymond Gaita will have to offer. So there are flyers, the information is available online. So I hope as many of you as possible not only join, the more important thing than joining is to let others know. So have you thought about conversation? Have you thought about dialogue? Have you thought about humanity? And if not, there's always a time and place to start. All right, thank you very much. We'll be dealing with another very simple subject, Indigenous wisdom and its role in Australian society. Okay, next week. Thank you again.